I'd like to welcome Dougald McLaurin into our webinar, and he'll be giving his paper on collective nouns. Like I said, he's a current PhD student in Old Testament. Well, take it away, Dougald.
All right, thank you, Christy, for that introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick and let you guys see my presentation. And thank you all for attending. This is the first time I've been able to present my research to Southeastern, so I'm excited about that. So let's go ahead and get started. Defining collective nouns, how cognitive linguistics can help Hebrew grammarians. All Hebrew grammars have something to say about collective nouns, and yet collective nouns remain a mystery to biblical scholars. The litany of definitions from Hebrew grammars will not be covered in this presentation. In general, however, definitions may be summarized along these lines. A collective noun is a noun which has a singular form that refers to a group of real-world entities. And what's important with this kind of summation of all these Hebrew grammars and their definitions of collectives is they focus on the morphosyntactic level of the collective noun and what it's referring to in the real world. What cognitive linguistics is going to do is say, how do we conceptualize these structures and substructures in our mind? And how does that play out and inform us about what's going on syntactically? Yet the simple definition can be misleading since it does not do justice to the complexity of grammatical and syntactical relationships that involve the category of number. As Ian Young writes, quote, "It is not possible to find a convincing grammatical explanation for the use of a singular and plural in every single case with collective nouns," end quote. This paper will argue that collective nouns helps us express the complexity of collectives better than previous definitions found in Hebrew grammars, and therefore subsequently help lead to a better understanding of how they function grammatically. Using cognitive linguistics, this paper argues that collective nouns are a varied group of nouns. Some focus on a group of real-world entities as a collection, while others focus on an individual members of the group. Others, in certain syntactical situations, may refer to either the group or its members. And even in this definition, I'm using syntax and grammatical discussions when we're also talking about conceptual nature of these. So. Anyways, simply adopting this definition of collective nouns is not the only helpful correction offered by cognitive linguistics to previous definitions. In order to better understand how collective nouns work, two categories of nouns that previously have been included in this discussion of collective nouns needs to be excluded from biblical Hebrew grammars. Specifically, these two categories of nouns are mass nouns and proper nouns. Once these two categories have been excluded, Frank Houston's work on Dutch collective nouns is applied to collectives in biblical Hebrew. By doing so, three distinct types of collective nouns are identified: those which focus on the unity of the collective, those which focus on the members of the collective, and those which may do either. The corpus of this study includes collective nouns that appear in the book of Deuteronomy. When available, the examples will come from Deuteronomy. If no data are available in Deuteronomy, examples from the larger classical biblical Hebrew corpus are used. And here I'm using Lamb and Pardee's definition of classical biblical Hebrew from a handbook of biblical Hebrew. Before beginning with an analysis with the Hebrew data, a short excursus on how collective nouns are conceived in the mind using mass and proper nouns will be helpful. So let's go ahead and begin with the first exclusion I'm suggesting, which is mass nouns. The first category that should be excluded from the discussion concerning collective nouns is what has previously been called mass nouns or non-count nouns. And just for this paper, just so other people are aware in this discussion, we're talking most of the time the term noun, non-count noun is used in the larger linguistic discussion, whereas in Hebrew we have primarily focused on using mass nouns. I'm using mass nouns for this paper as the term I'm using this term mass nouns instead of non-count nouns, even though I prefer non-count nouns. In his article, Collective Nouns in Ancient Hebrew, Heinrich von Siebenthal argues that there are three categories of collective nouns. One is group nouns, the second category is generic or class nouns, and the third category of collective nouns are mass nouns. He describes mass nouns as, quote, an unbounded mass with total mass constituting the class, end quote. The examples he gives are yayin, wine, kesef, silver, zahav, gold, and chalav, milk. Furthermore, he states that like generic nouns, but unlike ordinary group nouns, mass nouns are uncountable. So we have somewhat of that non-count idea going on with Siebenthal. And unlike both generic nouns and group nouns, mass nouns always combine with a singular verb when assuming the subject role. The mass nouns themselves, however, make reference simply to an unbounded mass. Then we get this quote, no matter how many real-world entities are involved, in this respect resembling generic nouns. There is a bit of tension present within the quote. On the one hand, Siebenthal wants to treat these nouns as an unbounded mass, which touches on the conceptual nature of mass nouns found in cognitive linguistics. However, Siebenthal still wants to associate his mass nouns with count nouns when he discusses the number of real-world entities that they reference. This is partly due to the fact that he combines, I think, he's talking about afar or dust in Hebrew, and he's thinking of it in smaller particles along other true mass nouns like yayin, wine. The confusion seems to be present also in Walkie and O'Connor's grammar in their description of the collective noun, though it is not explicitly stated. So Walkie and O'Connor never use mass nouns as in Hebrew as their examples, but in their discussion of collective nouns, they talk about people alongside water and salt, which would be other mass nouns in English. So there's some, they don't expressly state it, but it is present in their grammar. This is primarily a result of a focus on the morphosyntactic and lexical analysis with collective nouns. In other words, the focus is on a singular noun that references multiple real-world entities, and they function as subjects of syntactical elements that are in disagreement with the collective singular form. So it will take plural verbs or plural pronouns, etc., when the form itself is singular. Cognitive linguistics, however, considers both nouns and count nouns as a binary within the classification of nouns, so they're opposites. While syntactical observations may help distinguish between these two classes of nouns, the primary categorization of these nouns is conceptual. However, the easiest way to distinguish these nouns is revealed by how they are counted or divided. Greville Corbett provides a helpful illustration for this. If we take the referent a book or a car and divide it, what remains is no longer a book or a car. However, if we take water and divide its referent, we're still left with water. Thus, a book may be said to be bounded while water is not. This does not entail that it is not has no boundaries at all, like a lake or an ocean. Rather, they are not in view of interest. So those boundaries are not in view. The actual substance is in view. So end quote. Sorry, that actual substance comment was my own, not his. So anyways, another way of conceptualizing this is that mass nouns are usually quantified by measure words rather than counted directly with numerals. Therefore, when we, or the biblical text, refer to a specific portion of a mass noun, a unit of measurement must be added to the lexeme. So we can see in Exodus 29, 40b, Reva'it hahin hayayin is a fourth of a hin of wine is needed to count the substance of wine. Mass nouns do not refer to a particular number of real-world entities, as the general definition of collective noun implies. Rather, it refers to a substance or a portion of that substance. Because of the difference in the conceptual nature of mass nouns and count nouns, special care to not include these in the discussion of collective nouns should be taken in the future. And although mass nouns have not been included in every discussion concerning collective nouns, as the next category has, confusion has definitely entered into the discussion, as we see with Siebenthal's articles, on occasion by including this separate noun class in the discussion alongside collective nouns. Second exclusion I recommend is proper nouns. The second category that should be removed from the discussion of collective nouns is proper nouns. The only dissertation written on the Hebrew collective noun was written by Keith A. Massey. He focuses his work on collective nouns in the Deuteronomistic history and compiles statistics using the markedness-based theory of Broman Jacobson and Nikolai Trubetskoy. He observes verbal number agreement with a wide range of collectives across the Deuteronomistic history, including Am, people, Yisrael, Israel, Goy, nation, Ada, congregation, Moab for Moab, Aram for Syria, and bait for dynasty, and merges all their usages together. So in other words, every single noun, whether it's a collective noun or a proper noun, when analyzed with verbal number, is thrown into one stat line. They're not differentiated between these types of nouns. Throughout his dissertation, there is no distinction made for the data of proper nouns from such as Israel or Goy. A similar trend is seen in many Hebrew grammars which use proper nouns as examples for collective nouns. So in their actual discussion of collective nouns, they use some of the examples are Yisrael or Moab or Aram. These include GKC, Williams, Brockelman, and a lot of the studies that are specific for number-related issues or collective nouns, or where these play into that discussion, such as E.J. Revell's work. You've got the diachronic studies of Arno Kropot and the of Polzin, Robert Polzin. All of those include references to proper nouns alongside collective nouns when analyzing their data. Collective linguistics, however, treats proper nouns as a substructure or subclass within a larger whole of common count nouns, rather than classifying them as collectives. Richard Langacker states, as one component of its meaning, one domain in its matrix, a proper name incorporates a cognitive model pertaining to how the form is used in the relevant social group. According to the idealized model, each member of the group has a distinct name, with the consequence that the name itself is sufficient to identify it. The name Jack, therefore, carries with it the supposition that within the relevant group, that is a family, there is just one person referred to in this manner. The name can thus be thought of as defining a type. The type, person named Jack, which in the context of the group, family, the model specifies having just one instance, end quote. If we apply this concept to biblical Hebrew, the name Moshe for Moses then refers to a particular individual within the substructure of, or the structure of Beit Av, the father's household. Additionally, Yisrael refers to a particular member of the structure of Am, people, or perhaps Goy, nation. Furthermore, proper nouns require different syntactical relationships from common count nouns. Van Langendonk and others point out that proper nouns cannot take restrictive clauses, nor may they be used in an anaphoric sense. Because of space, a simple look at restrictive clauses and proper nouns should suffice to illustrate the difference here. A syntactical difference between collective nouns and proper nouns demonstrates the conceptual difference of these nouns. In order to be the subject of a restrictive clause, the proper noun Yisrael must have an individualizer noun preceding it in construct. So we see here with Exodus 5:14 and Exodus 6:5 that we have Shotrei B'nai Yisrael, then we have Asher. So the foremen of the sons of Israel, whom the taskmasters of Pharaoh set over them, were beaten. So we have that Asher introducing that restrictive clause. And then we see again B'nai Yisrael being used in Exodus 6:5 before the restrictive clause Asher is introduced, so the sons of Israel. In the 27 instances where Yisrael occurs with a restrictive clause in the CBH corpus, it has another noun in construct with it. So it never appears by itself on just Yisrael with a restrictive clause. In contrast, collective nouns such as Am, people, and Goy, nation, may be the direct syntactic subject of a restrictive clause. So here we see in Deuteronomy 28:33, Am Asher lo yada ata. And then we see in Deuteronomy 28:36, I'm skipping to the highlighted part, El Goy Asher lo yada ata. So there we see again, a people whom you have not known in Deuteronomy 28, and a nation whom you have not known in Deuteronomy 28:36. The syntactic differences in the use of the restrictive clauses demonstrate the conceptual differences between common collective nouns like Am and Goy and proper nouns like Yisrael. Restrictive clauses limit the immediate scope of a particular noun. Proper nouns already do this because they have a unique denotation and thus already limit the immediate scope of the particular noun. They cannot be limited any further. This is not true of Am or Goy. The conceptual reference and function of a proper noun is different from a collective noun and will obscure the data if included with collective nouns in research concerning collective nouns. So now let's move to my proposal, or more accurately, Frank Houston's proposal. The first two suggestions have focused on what noun types should be excluded from collective nouns. This section proposes three conceptual categories for collective nouns in biblical Hebrew. As Ian Young points out, quote, scholars must be careful to talk about collective nouns as an undifferentiated mass. Future research on collective nouns, their behavior in various parts of the Hebrew Bible, and any diachronic or other conclusions based on this must be done at a much more sophisticated level than has previously been the case, end quote. This section hopes to lay out a more sophisticated way of understanding the undifferentiated mass of collective nouns. The research of cognitive linguist Frank Houston provides a helpful framework for collective nouns and will be employed in the remainder of this paper. Houston argues that collective nouns such as committee, family, or team are all too oftenly erroneously defined as semantically plural but grammatically singular. Sounds a little familiar. As nouns that have singular form but plural meaning. End quote. Houston suggests alternatively that collective nouns have a dual conceptual nature. On the one end of the spectrum are collective nouns that focus on the collection level of the noun, and on the other end of the spectrum are the collective nouns that focus on the member level. The collection level is when the collection is conceptualized as one, and the member level is when the collection is conceptualized as more than one. In other words, collective nouns may be conceived as referring to a unified group or as a differentiated group of individuals that share a common trait. Perhaps a brief example in English may help to understand these concepts. Two collective nouns in English, such as crowd and people, are both singular nouns that refer to a number of real-world entities. Both may be pluralized, so we can say crowds and we can say peoples. However, their conceptual difference is exposed when cardinal numbers are applied to these nouns. English speakers cannot say to crowd because it's unacceptable. Crowd does not always allow access to the member level, only the collection level. To speak of the members of the crowd, other nouns must be added. Something like two women from the crowd provides access to the individual members of the noun crowd. The opposite is true of people. Two people is a perfectly acceptable phrase in English referring to two persons within a larger group of people. This demonstrates that people in English may be conceptualized at the member level, while crowd only at the collection level. Frank Houston visualizes these two conceptualizations this way. And there's a brief note of difference. Frank Houston, in his example for member level, only has a slightly thinner line that surrounds all those individual circles. I've decided to use a dotted line to kind of distinguish between those two a little bit more clearly. Collective nouns, therefore, may display properties that tend towards one of these two types of conceptualizations. Furthermore, as the data indicates, some have characteristics of both, depending on the context, as we'll see. So how does someone determine if a collective noun is conceptualized as the collection level or the member level? Houston's answer is to provide a conceptual profile of collective nouns, and he does this by using adjectives in Dutch and English. In order to develop this profile, the researcher must determine, quote, which collective nouns distribute properties over the collection and member level, end quote. By observing adjectives and pronouns in biblical Hebrew, the distributive properties of collective nouns may be determined. It is also easier to determine this in Hebrew since, unlike Dutch and English, Hebrew grammatically codes number with adjectives. Even with this help, however, filling out a conceptual profile completely for collective nouns is not always possible, given the limited data found within the Hebrew Bible for some collective nouns. Houston has determined three types of collective nouns in Dutch. A type 1 collective noun is a quote, collective noun which consists of those that generally trigger collection level interpretations, end quote. This type of collective noun will focus on the collection as a whole rather than its individual members. These collection level interpretations should generally provide number agreement with adjectives and pronouns, especially when these nouns are pluralized. In the book of Deuteronomy and the CBH corpus, Hebrew type 1 nouns are best exemplified by mikneh, livestock or cattle, and goy, nation. The primary feature they share is number agreement with adjectives, demonstratives, and pronouns, both independent and suffixed. When these nouns appear in the singular, their adjectives and pronouns are always singular. When they are plural, the adjectives and pronouns are always plural. So let's take a look at Deuteronomy 9:14. As an example of this, we see lagoy atzum varav. So we have two singular adjectives that are referring to goy, a nation. Goy is in singular. The adjectives are in the singular. In Deuteronomy 4:38, we have goyim, gadalim, va'atzumim. So there we have the same adjective in this case with goyim, and all of them are plural. And so this is not surprising to us, but as we move along these types, we'll see that there's actually disagreement in this area. And I think this is an important, this helps us see that. So this is kind of setting the base work for that. With demonstratives, we see hagoy hazeh in Exodus 33:13, so the singular form with the singular demonstrative. And then in Deuteronomy 7:17, we see hagoyim ha'ele, so the plural with the plural. And this is consistent throughout the CBH corpus for goy. If we look at suffix pronouns, we see, it's not highlighted, but ki migoy, gadol asher lo, the third singular suffix pronoun referring back to goy. And then we see in Deuteronomy 7:17, we see hagoyim ha'ele. And then at the end of the line here, we see the third masculine plural suffix ending there referring back to goy. Also with cardinal numbers, we see a difference in the number of the collective noun itself. So 2 Samuel 7:23 says goy echad, so one nation, they're singular, the goy is singular. And then we see shnei goyim in Genesis 25:23, where a number greater than one has shifted goy to be plural. In these examples, agreement in number is maintained by type 1 collective nouns and the adjectives and pronouns that modify them. This seems to indicate a collection level focus. Next, it would be helpful to identify member level nouns labeled by Houston as type 3 nouns. Houston says, quote, type 3 nouns generally trigger member level interpretations. In short, type 1 and type 3 nouns are two extremes of the same gradient, a gradient of member level accessibility. In Hebrew, type 3 member level collective nouns would be zone or sheep or little flock. Assuming type 1 collective nouns maintain agreement in number and adjectives, with adjectives, etc., then the reader should expect type 3 nouns to show number disagreement with usages that conceptualize the noun as a group of individualized members. Using the same adjective, compare the examples of type 1 and type 3 nouns side by side. Notice that the type 1 noun mikneh alongside the type 3 noun zone here. So here we see the same exact adjective being used. In Deuteronomy 3:19, it's with mikneh and it's singular rav. And in Genesis 30:43, we see zone with ravot. So we see the plural form of this adjective modifying a singular form collective noun. The type 1 collective mikneh maintains the agreement between the adjective and the noun. The type 3 collective noun zone, however, shows the disagreement with the adjective. This number disagreement with zone is found throughout the CBH corpus, while agreement with the adjective is found with mikneh throughout the CBH corpus. The same is true for demonstrative agreement, though this only occurs once in the CBH with zone and only once more in the parallel passage that appears in Chronicles. So just for those who haven't studied diachronic change, Samuel is going to be considered classical biblical Hebrew, while Chronicles is going to be considered late biblical Hebrew. And typically there's some debate. So we're seeing the parallel passage here appears exactly the same in both cases. So 2 Samuel 24:17, we see va'ele hazon. So we see that we have a little bit of a different word order because it's a question. The question is, and these sheep, what have they done? Is one translation of that. And so so here we see the plural demonstrative pronoun with the singular form of sheep. Again, contrasted to goyim, which appeared as goyim with the plural demonstrative. Though the examples for adjectives and demonstratives are very few with zone, every example displays disagreement with number when in the CBH corpus. Furthermore, type 3 nouns can only refer to a group when an intermediate quantifier noun is added. So when zone is trying to refer to the group of sheep, we have the introduction of another noun and construct with it. in order to access that at the collection level. So here we see Sholasha Edre Zone for 3 flocks of sheep. And so it's referring to 3 groups of sheep. Cardinal numbers must be used directly with type 3 nouns, but they refer to the number of individual members in that group. So if we contrast that view of the collection level with the member level, here we see Zon, Sholoshet, Alafim, 3,000 sheep are seen here as individual sheep, not 3,000 groups of sheep. And then we see in Genesis 25:23, just as a reminder, when we see a cardinal number greater than 1 added to the type 1 collective noun, it's made plural. So we have that distinction here between zone being singular with a cardinal number greater than 1, and we see goyim with a cardinal number greater than 1. Finally, type 2 nouns refer to collective nouns that may be used as either collection level or member level. Nouns that match this type are in Hebrew are kahal and am, or assembly and people. In Hebrew, these collectives bear the same type of agreement that was present with type 1 collective nouns when it comes to adjectives and demonstratives. However, type 2 collective nouns differ from type 1 with independent pronouns and cardinal numbers. In the evidence from the CBH corpus, these collectives, while remaining singular in form, may take either plural or singular independent pronouns. So we see this from the example in Deuteronomy 31:16. Ha'am hazeh. So there we see the demonstrative being singular with ha'am. Later on, we see hu, the independent pronoun, third singular, being used where am is the antecedent. And then we see the 2 suffix pronouns with be-kirbo, and ito, both being third singular suffix pronouns that reference ha'am. As opposed to Exodus 5:7, where we see la'am being the antecedent for the independent third masculine plural pronoun haim, and then we see the third plural suffix pronoun lahem later on in the sentence. Though the occurrences of am with an independent pronoun are few, these examples show both formal number agreement and disagreement with independent pronouns. The use with other syntactical elements, such as the singular demonstrative in Genesis 31:16, may focus the interpretation of the noun on the collection level. Notice that there is no demonstrative in Exodus 5:7, and it is plural, more like a collection level noun. Actually, that should say a member level noun. I'm sorry. So type 2, nouns may also refer to the collection or member level with cardinal numbers. In Genesis 11:6, the focus is on the collection level when all humanity is said to be echad, so one people. In Genesis 26:10, however, the focus shifts to the member level when Isaac is questioned by Abimelech concerning his true relationship with Rebekah, and there it says, Echad ha'am, what is it that you have done to us? One of the people, so one member of the larger group of people, could have easily slept with your wife. While both of these examples have am, people, as a singular noun used with echad, one, they both are referencing the 2 different conceptualizations of am, both at the member and the collection level. Type 2 nouns also behave like type 3 nouns when they occur with cardinal numbers that are greater than 1. In these instances, a member level interpretation is represented. In Judges 7:3, for example, we see the Esrim Ushnaim Elif, and there is 22,000 people, ha'am, being what is being described there. I'm going to give a note about that in just a second. But actually, I think I skipped a slide. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that then. So one of the things I discovered in reviewing this paper was that one of the things we run into with cardinal numbers greater than 1 with am is actually in every occurrence in the Hebrew Bible, we have a min partitive preposition on the front of it. So I found that interesting. We contrast that with Exodus 9:6, which is the only time that mikneh is really referred to with a 1, and there we have the min partitive being used there as well. So I find this interesting that maybe with numerals greater than 1 for am, we have a partitive, a min having to be used in order to access that, whereas for the Echad one, we need that for McNay. Right now, that's where I am. More research needs to be done, but it definitely struck me as I was rehearsing for this. I saw that and I was like, okay, we need to change that. Someone else pointed out to me the partitive use of McNay, and that led me to think about that. So anyways, so we see that the number 22,000 forms a subset of the larger group known as It does not reference 22,000 groups. A restatement of the definition of collective nouns becomes clearer after the survey of evidence. Collective nouns are a varied group of nouns. Some focus on a group level of real-world entities as a whole, others focus on the members of the group, and yet others may, in different syntactic situations, refer to either the group or its members. Using Frank Houston's scheme, type 1 collectives are those collectives that focus only on the whole group, while type 3 tend to focus on the related members. Finally, type 2 collective nouns have the flexibility to do either. Though the sampling from the Deuteronomy and the CVH corpus may be small, it demonstrates along consistent lines of evidence that collective nouns are not all equal and must be studied more carefully. Each of these nouns have exhibited different number patterns in regard to adjectives, pronouns, both independent and suffixed, alongside cardinal numbers. These patterns of number, however, do not appear to be haphazard or random. These patterns directly reveal the conceptual understanding of the collective noun that lies behind the syntax. Even if the particular nouns surveyed here are later proven to belong to a different category of collective noun, the hope is that these collective nouns will help Hebrew grammarians view collectives as less mysterious than before. Thank you.